store, where we are clearly back to hosting in-person events here at the store. We also have some great events at Sidwell Friends, Zadie Smith, for example, and other locations throughout the city. We've got partnered events, supported events, trips, classes, all sorts of fun stuff. It can all be found on our website at politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I do ask that y'all check your phones, make sure they're silenced. I know numbers for COVID are going up, and we've got a busy crowd. If you'd be more comfortable with a mask but don't have one, raise your hand. I can get you one later. And then what else? After the conversation, there will be a Q&A. We will ask that you line up at this microphone over here so we can capture your question on the audio recording. We are live streaming. It will be on our YouTube, so you can send it to all your friends afterwards. After the event, we will have a signing line that will also start here at this pillar. The books can be bought behind the counter from one of our lovely booksellers. We will also ask that you fold up your chairs. I'll remind you of all of this later. Don't worry, I'm throwing a lot at you. So, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Jeremy Eichler, celebrating the release of his book, Time's Echo, The Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Music of Remembrance. In Time's Echo, the award-winning critic and cultural historian Jeremy Eichler makes a passionate and revelatory case for the power of music as culture's memory, an art form uniquely capable of carrying forward meaning from the past. With a critic's ear, a scholar's erudition, and a novelist's eye for detail, Eichler shows how four towering composers, Richard Strauss, Arnold Schoenberg, Dmitri Shostakovich, thank you all, and Benjamin Britten lived through the era of the Second World War and the Holocaust and later transformed their experiences into deeply moving, transcendent works of music, scores that echo lost time. An award-winning critic and cultural historian, Eichler currently serves as the chief classical music critic of the Boston Globe. He is a recipient of the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for writing published in The New Yorker, a fellowship at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and a public scholars grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He will be in conversation with Anne Midgette. Midgette, writer and critic, for 11 years, consolidated her various cultural interests under the title of the chief classical music critic of the Washington Post before leaving the job to focus on finishing a long-planned book. Please join me in welcoming these two wonderful people.
Well, thank you. This is on, right? Thank you for that, and thank you all for coming. It's so exciting to be here in person. The last one of these I did was virtual during the pandemic, and it's really wonderful to be here. And wonderful to be here with Jeremy, who is an old friend and colleague from the music critic trenches in the New York Times, going way back. So it's really exciting to see all that he's achieved and exciting to read his book, which I hope you will all have a chance to do. Jeremy, this is a career-defining book. You've been working on it for a long time. And it's a very intense book, and it's a big, very challenging book to sum up tidily. What would your elevator pitch be? How would you bring this book across in a couple of sentences to somebody who wants to know what it's about?
Absolutely. First of all, though, thank you to Nicole and to the store for having me here. The pub day is tomorrow, so this is exciting to kind of jump the gun with all of you here and to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. And thank you to Anne for having this conversation with me. Anne and I do go way back in our journeys as writers and critics, so this is really a treat. Time's Echo is really a book about reimagining the power and promise of art in our lives today. It does that by really rethinking the entire meaning of classical music in the sense of considering it really as a bridge to eras past and as a kind of gateway to arriving at some kind of deeper sense of understanding, empathy, felt contact with history. And of course, I mean these darker eras of the 20th century, the sort of suffering and traumas of previous generations, but also the book spends time talking about what came before and the sort of utopian dreams of European culture, the kind of visions of dignity and freedom that in some ways believe are sort of no less compelling, no less important for having not yet come to pass. So the book explores all those ideas through, you heard a little bit in the introduction, through the stories. It's kind of a tapestry of stories drawn from the lives and art of four composers, Schoenberg, Strauss, Shostakovich, and Britten. And their years during their paths during the years of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and then the haunting memorials that they created afterwards. It is a book about history and memory, but it's a book that's really angled towards the present and towards the future. Yeah.
What led you to the subject? I imagine this is not a subject that sort of you woke up one morning and said, I think I'll write this book. It would take a while to coalesce. Your elevator pitch failed, by the way. The elevator is on 110. But that's great because it's definitely worth the ride.
Yes, we need faster elevators. Yes, so it's not an era. It's not a time. I feel like my back is to half the people here. It's not a time that is terra incognita for most of us. The literature on the Holocaust, the Second World War alone does fill entire libraries. One of the questions I always wondered about was sort of what does it mean to have all of this knowledge that's kind of bound between these hardcovers, sitting in archives, sitting on shelves. There was a survivor, a French survivor from the 1960s, who critiqued his own society for publishing all of these books about the Holocaust, and in a way publishing them so as the critique went, so as to forget them, so as to place a kind of unimaginable and in many ways morally unassimilable past into, his phrase was, the cold storage of history. So as someone who for my whole life has felt really passionately about music and its own power, I realized at a certain point that it really was the art form, at least in my eyes, that was best positioned to kind of burn through the cold storage of history and possibly open up all these other kind of dimensions of contact with this past. Precisely now, to be writing a book like this, I'm aware that it's also coming at a moment when the generation that lived through that era and is capable of telling its own stories is disappearing. And I went. I think Anne knows parts of the story. I went. I immersed myself in as much of the historical literature about this era that I could, and I kept looking for the book that was going to do all these things that I just explained. That was going to be about. There are books about stone monuments and memory, poetry and memory, cinema and memory. I kept waiting to find the book so I could read it about music and memory. And eventually I realized that it wasn't really out there, the one that I wanted to read, and so I would probably have to write it first.
That brings me to something else I was going to ask you about why music is more qualified than other arts. How does music act as a bridge to the past in a way that, say, painting doesn't, or literature doesn't? Because you can talk about the cold storage of history, but there are many searing literary documents that we read. And in fact, a lot of the music you write about, I'm jumping to later questions, involves words and involves great literature, which is transformed through being integrated with music, as words always are. What are your thoughts about that? Why music?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I definitely did not want to get into a kind of sort of a showdown among the arts, which one was going to be more compelling. But I did feel like every art form opens up a different relationship to the past, and in some ways carries forward different aspects of the past. And so for me, there is something about music itself that, first of all, let's just begin by thinking about how visceral a medium it is. If you sort of think of sound vibrates all around us. It can vibrate within us. The critic John Berger says that when we listen to a song, we find ourselves inside a message. So that sense of immersive contact with an art, I never found. I think with painting, and a composer I love talks about how the eyes, the visual senses, draw us outward. When we look at a painting, we're looking outward, and that music, again, the ears draw us inward. So there are all these sort of aspects, I think, but that one could say about music, about sound as a medium, and then there's this whole fascinating aspect of the dimensions of music as this kind of its ability to play with time. If you think about a composer putting down notes on a page in 1823, and then 200 years later, we have someone standing right in front of us playing the notes from that page and bringing that work to life right in front of us. When the composer put down those notes, he was really, or she was, distilling worlds of thought and feeling and emotion and something essential about their time into those notes. And when it gets played back to us, we're literally hearing the past speaking in the present. And so there is this way that music kind of warps time in that sense, brings closer that which is distant. And almost I came to think of music as almost the language of time's non-linearity, that the language that the art that lets us travel like that. And if you think about it, that's really quite similar to memory itself, because memory by definition challenges the pastness of the past and the kind of objective distance of history. Something that's really powerful in our memory, an event that's seared there somewhere, might haunt us with a kind of potency far deeper than something that happened just yesterday. So there were all of these sort of elective affinities between music and memory that I just felt like I really wanted to try to spend some time exploring on their own terms, but also opening up through a series of the stories that the book tries to tell.
Well, the book is full of these beautiful just vignettes and details and little I didn't know that moments. But directly relating to what you were saying, the first chapter opens with the experience of listening to a very old Bach recording and how the hiss and pop of the early technology becomes part of the experience of listening. And that relates to what you're saying in the way that the time becomes a part of the message. But I did also wonder reading it, we are at a point, as you say, when many of the people who witnessed World War II are leaving us, but generationally, people under 30 today don't have the same experience of the medium of musical transmission that we do. That is, I grew up listening to LPs and moved on to cassette tapes and moved on to CDs, and now everybody streams everything. And so when you talk about the hiss and pop of the Bach recording, it really speaks to me in a way, that effort to reclaim the sound. Do you think that's something that will last? Or because I have encountered students who were really put off with my old recordings. I'm a big old recording junkie, and who were really like, why does it sound so bad? What is that hissing? And you're like, but listen to the voice. How can you hear the voice through that hiss? Do you think that will change because that transmission is such a part of our experience?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think I think that I've also encountered, and even among people who already know that they love classical music, people will often sometimes have a reflexively kind of skeptical or a resistance to listening to older recordings. And I totally get why the sound is oftentimes just not the same. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam has this beautiful phrase, the noise of time. And I came to think of those kinds of hisses and pops as the noise of time, as this sort of temporal, this registration in the sound of the temporal distance that the music's traveled to reach us today, and sort of like this sense of like a light shining from a distant star. And I think that you're right that's not a lot of the things that I write about maybe are becoming less and less part of the central streams of popular culture at the moment, but I also, in some ways, that made me all the more keen to try to open them up in all their fullness and really, not just. It's interesting. I always come back to this story that this line that Isaac Stern had, the great violinist Isaac Stern, and people would come to him, musicians, violinists often would come from around the world, and they'd play their pieces for him, and he would sort of pause afterwards and thank them for their efforts and their virtuosity and their expertise, and then he'd say, "Okay, I'd like you to play that again, that same piece, but this time, please show me not how you play the notes, but why." And for me, this was also very much a book not about the how to listen, because there are plenty of appreciation guides and courses and all kinds of things you could take, but really some core fundamental answers as to why.
That's great. When you're talking about musical monuments, it's interesting because the ones you pick in this book are unquestionably masterpieces of the 20th century. There are an awful lot of musical monuments that aren't. We all know commemorative works that are really second rate, where somebody wrote something for an occasion or because they were commissioned and it didn't come through. And of course, there are lots and lots of works of music that are powerful statements without having any literal connection, as you point out frequently in the book, and you do talk about, quote, abstract music. But I was curious if you thought anything about memorials. You also picked memorials that really resonated with the composers. It wasn't like, anybody remember Bernard Rogers' Elegy to FDR? I'm sure Bernard Rogers really felt deeply about FDR, but I would bet that none of us has heard that piece. Maybe in this crowd somebody's heard that piece. So do you think that, what do you are thoughts about musical monuments? Oh, and one more thing I would throw out there is that take Barbara's Adagio for strings, which has become the unofficial anthem of mourning for this culture, and yet it was not written as a memorial at all. It has kind of taken on that meaning through having experiences etched upon it, as it were.
Yeah. Right. There's so many questions within that question. Yeah, in a great way.
It's my weakness.
In a great way. One of the questions the book does take up is this whole question of meaning. Does the meaning come? Is it within the music, or is it within us? Kind of projecting it onto the music. And in the book, I suggest that it's really in the relationship between the two. That even if we could know the composer's full intentions as they put these scores out into the world, that today those intentions could no longer limit the fields of meaning that the pieces are capable of taking on. There's those sort of medieval writing tablets, the palimpsests, where it's as if each piece becomes a kind of palimpsest with a new layer of meaning with every performance, you could almost say. So over time, these works become these sorts of vast archives, portable archives of meaning and emotion that we can contact sort of across the centuries. I think that it's very true that there are some musical memorials out there that have been completely forgotten, many that have been completely forgotten, and that when you look at the stories, like John Fould's, the composer almost no one's heard about, wrote a world requiem that people just flocked to by the thousands. This was after the First World War, it broke all the records in history for sales at the Royal Albert Hall in London. And people were just raving and raving about this piece, and the archive is full of his letters written to him about how your music went down into my very core, and now the piece was last done, I think, in 1927, and then not heard again since to the year 2000 or something like that. So aesthetically,
should it be heard? Should we revive it?
No, I don't think so for that one. I don't think so for that one. But one of the things I ask us to do in the book is just sort of ask whether aesthetic terms are the only ones on which some of these memorials should be judged, because they also clearly play these other social roles in the society and help us think about all kinds of questions about mourning and moving on or not moving on. Some of the memorials I discuss actually take a very pointed position in saying that perhaps the job of art after atrocity is not to soothe things over and make us all just kind of breathe a sigh and move onward with our lives. Possibly the point of art is to actually hold open these wounds and make us continue to think about the conditions of our world and our society that led to war in the first place. So there's all sorts of different approaches that different memorials take. I don't think they're all created equally, but I do think that the ones I chose, at least, I was willing to forgive some of their aesthetic sins because they gave back so much in terms of the other stories, the other lives, the landscapes, and these moments in history that they illuminated by writing about them. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, I have so many things that come up in response to what you're saying that I pull off a little bit. But the idea that music should make a statement, this is what I wanted to say. You talked about art's job after crisis to sort of show us the pain. And I've been dealing with this question since we were at the Times, and so have you, but is it art's job to do anything? Is it prioritizing works that make a statement over works that don't make a statement? And are they a priori better? In the book, you quote Adorno writing about Schoenberg's dissonance and saying that, and we've often heard this, or versions of the statement, that dissonance is kind of the language of the ugliness and harshness of the modern world, and we don't need beauty in art. I draw the line at that a little bit because beautiful art changes over generations too. We have different ideas of what's beautiful. But do you think that art should seek to make a big statement? And is art that seeks to make a statement more important? Would you make that categorical assertion?
I would think that sometimes art that is trying least to make the statement makes the biggest statements. You mentioned that line from Adorno, which we could go back to. The one that probably people hear the most is his famous line that to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. And that was an interesting point of entry for me because in a way, no one ever talks about the fact that that was not his last word on the subject. He kept on thinking and writing about that, and maybe 20 years later, he wrote in an essay a line that always stuck with me. He wrote that because the world has outlived its own demise, it needs art as its unconscious chronicle. So that idea of any art, and music in particular, serving as not as a conscious one, and let's make a big statement here, but even as an unconscious chronicle for a world that's outlived its own demise, for a world sort of after Auschwitz, after the whole generation that lived through that era is disappearing. That was a powerful point of connection for me. Yeah.
Yep. No, I think it's so important because in today's rhetoric, it gets thrown around a lot that we need art because it holds up a mirror to our society. And I feel like the memorials that do that self-consciously are often the ones we most quickly forget because they're, as you say, setting out to do something that's not fundamentally artistic.
Right. I mean, right. And one of the premises of the book, this, when I talk about music and memory, sometimes the thing that people relate to most easily is often, as I did before any of this, you're driving in your car and a song comes on the radio and all of a sudden you're transported, sort of like Proust's Madeleine, back to something that happened to you, maybe decades ago, maybe when you were back, in high school or something like that. And apropos your question, this book tries to turn the corner and say it's not just we who remember music, but music that remembers us. That music as this kind of record, this unconscious chronicle of human society that crystallizes something essential about the era of its birth. And it can do so in these other ways. Back to the medium question, there are all these writers and poets have tried to put their finger on it, but there's something very powerful about music as the art form that can communicate so deeply without expressing anything in language, right? It's these deep truths, yet untranslatable ones. So Rilke called music the language where languages end. Thomas Mann called music he called this quality the spoken unspokenness that music possesses alone. So those are some ways that I also felt like music was there to help us unlock these puzzles around memory and history and unconscious chronicles.
all statements that sort of bespeak the German in which they were first made, to sort of intricacy of the language, jigsaw puzzling around the idea.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask, in the time during which you wrote this book, what effect did current events have on you? There are so many points of reference of historical things that resonate today, but you also wrote about Strauss and his briefly librettist Stefan Zweig, focusing on Innerlichkeit, the interiority, while the world is falling apart and Nazism is rising around them. They're trying to just focus on the art and be pure. To what extent, you mentioned the current events in Ukraine a little bit at the end of the book, to what extent did the development of the socioeconomic world around you affect your writing, if at all, or were you just focused on the past?
Yeah, it was for me. It was a bit surreal to see. I spend a lot of time telling the story of the Soviet war on Holocaust memory, and the fact that after the Nazis withdrew from the occupied Soviet Union, that on their way out they destroyed much evidence of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, where entire communities being lined up and gunned down into ravines. They burned that evidence, but then the Soviet Union destroyed the memory. They really they refused to mark many of these graves, and refused to even let mourners congregate on anniversaries, and really refused to have any type of memorialization that would particularize the Holocaust as an event that was particularized to Jewish communities. The idea being that Stalin wanted to collectivize the losses, and so these were Soviet losses writ large, and not the other part of it being that under Marxist-Leninist doctrine, fascism was supposed to be the end stage of capitalism. So there was no room for anti-Semitism as an understanding of the motor of the Nazi movement. So for all of these reasons, there is this incredible story of Holocaust suppression in the years after the war in the Soviet Union, a silence that Dmitri Shostakovich broke very, very powerfully with his Babi Yar Symphony, a setting of the poem by Yevgeny Yevtushenko. That's the first line is, "There is no monument over Babi Yar." So that was an incredibly courageous moment in the early 1960s when Shostakovich did that, and in a way his symphony, sort of note by note, became the first monument to those victims. But there I was writing about this history of memory suppression in the Soviet Union, and then Putin invades, and Ukraine claiming one of the goals was to denazify, which was already very, very confusing and troubling as an assumption, as a kind of statement in its own terms. I don't know if you all remember this, but early on, there were actually two different Holocaust memorials that were the targets of Russian bombing. So the site at Babi Yar was bombed, and a second site as well. And so this idea that these older Soviet dreams of empire that Putin was kind of rehabilitating, those attacks reminded me very viscerally of the idea that those older dreams were always accompanied by this kind of war on memory itself. So the past was really coming back to haunt the present and all around me as I wrote, and that was a powerful experience.
I bet. I would add that this is very much a book about history as well as a book about music, and some of the evocations, the whole Baba Yar section was amazing, just to bring to life historical events that you kind of thought you knew. There's a lot of specificity and new detail, and really, really well done.
Thank you.
One of the things we deal with a lot as critics is the idea of, hate the artist, love the art. Or we deal with it a lot as art lovers. We know there are biographies of people who did terrible things, and how do we deal with their paintings or their music, or Richard Wagner, what do we do with that? And it's interesting to me that your book fuses them. Similarly, we're supposed to separate art and politics. Your book specifically talks about the joining of art and politics. I found it refreshing and fascinating, and wondered what your thinking was behind doing that. Specifically, Richard Strauss, you really you were very critical of Richard Strauss in a very refreshing and factually based way when we all think Richard Strauss was not really political and went along with the Nazis and then lived largely independently. And you don't let him get away with that at all. You really show that he was morally culpable for his actions. But anyway, as far as the hate the art, artist love the art, where do you stand on that now, given that you are making a case for the intertwining of these things to such a degree?
Yeah, thank you for that question. With Strauss was the hardest of the four composers for me to write about by a long stretch, because he did have such this kind of complicated and morally problematic career during the Third Reich. For those who don't know, he stayed. Many people fled or were exiled. Many liberal German artists who didn't have to leave still chose to leave, like Thomas Mann. Strauss stayed, and not only stayed, but kind of had a very opportunistic partnership with the Nazi regime early on, accepting an honorary post directing an important musical organ that the party had set up. His own selfish vision was to try to, let me back up. I think he really cared about the operas of Richard Strauss. He wanted to get all kinds of reforms done in German copyright law and other aspects of cultural policy. That's what he told himself he was doing, and I came to think about Strauss as this sort of a study in kind of moral compartmentalization, that to a point that it felt to me sort of just plainly indefensible, and it felt important to say that clearly. I also found all kinds of points of sympathy for him. He had Jewish family members, and at a certain point he got stuck in this kind of vicious cycle where he would call in favors with senior Nazi officials to protect his own Jewish or half-Jewish grandchildren. So the path was so thorny for him, and yet at the end of the war he creates this incredible piece of music called Metamorphosen, and it's about a 20-minute piece of wordless music. And at the very end of it, it has a tone very different than anything else that he writes. His operas, as some of you know, oftentimes are sort of full of irony and wit, kind of a sense of this sort of objective distance on the past. And Metamorphosen all of a sudden has this very confessional air. It's very somber. It's very beautiful. It's all for strings, and the music kind of crests wildly. And you have the sense that it's really, there is some kind of confession going on, and that by that point in 1944 he had realized sort of how far astray he had wandered. There's no sign that it's a memorial score, except for in the very last line, Strauss writes, "In memoriam," those two words, "in memoriam." He never said to what, and the question sort of comes up every time the piece is performed. And one of the ways I got around, so I both wanted to not let him off the hook, but also still give us a way to have some kind of meaningful relationship to that extraordinary piece of music that he wrote. So one of the ways I thought about it was that he doesn't get to choose what it's in memoriam to anymore. And that one of the most maybe generous things we could do towards his reputation and towards his music was possibly to kind of reinscribe these pieces with some other kinds of memories that were not there originally, but were stories. I tell the story of his neighbors, his Jewish neighbors. He said, "I no idea what was going on. I wouldn't have understood. I wouldn't have believed you if you told me what was going on in the camps." He kind of had a real sort of head in the sand mentality after the war. That may or may not have been, but this stuff was happening all around him. So I tell the story of Strauss's neighbors and some other stories like that from the era, and I sort of ask us to remember those stories now, kind of reinscribing these pieces, so that this broader swath of history becomes part of what we come to hear when we hear the music itself. So that was the way I tried to handle Strauss the man and some of Strauss's music. Yeah.
I found it really refreshing in contrast to the hagiography one often gets about these figures. It was an eye-opener. And also interesting to go back and listen to like A Schweigsame Frau, the Strauss opera, after reading your book, and already the layering of memory and the layering of what you'd written about it changed my experience of it completely. It was really like, there it is, happening right in front of your eyes.
Yeah. maybe I'll tell the story of the story that kind of inspires that whole idea of reinscribing. Yeah, was a special one that also kind of one of the inspirations for the book. This was something I read about. The scholar James Young has a wonderful book about built Holocaust memorials, and he tells the story about an invisible monument that was created by a German conceptual artist, a man named Jochen Gertz, in the 90s in the far West German city of Saarbrücken. And in this city, there was a big cobblestone square in front of the main municipal building that in its time had held the Gestapo headquarters. And what this man did was he recruited a team of students who went into this cobblestone square under cover of darkness and chiseled out a whole number of cobblestones and replaced them temporarily with these sort of placeholder kind of dummy stones. He took the original stones back to his studio and inscribed in them the names of hundreds upon hundreds of Jewish cemeteries that had been either destroyed or abandoned under the Third Reich. Then, under cover of darkness again, he brought the original stones back with the inscriptions back to the square, to the spots where they had been removed, and he reinserted them. But here's where it took a conceptual leap. When he put the inscribed stones down back into the cobblestone square, he put them with the inscription side down, rendering the entire memorial invisible. And then when news of this sort of clandestine memory action kind of broke, and the kind of good citizens of Saarbrücken marched out to see, the defilement of public property, and they got out to this square and realized that the only standing forms in the entire square were themselves. So this would be an interior memorial. James Young has a lovely line, something along the lines of, the visitors would become the memorials for which they searched. So I thought that story was very powerful to me on many levels, but I even thought, just on a purely metaphorical level, what if we thought about the musical past as its own vast square of cobblestones? And in a way, the book itself chisels out these individual stones, these individual works of music, inscribes them with all kinds of new, adjacent, also important memories, stories, and then puts those stones back face down. So the sounding surfaces of the music, of course, remain the same, but the hope is that once we know what lies beneath, the stories that lie beneath, we might come to hear the works themselves and these sorts of moments from the culture's memory that still resonate between the notes.
That's fabulous. I would like to open it up for questions in a moment, but what you said leads me to an important question I did want to ask you before we get more people in, which is, what is your hope for the book? And you may have already answered that, but what would you like people to come away from the book, given that we've already talked about how nobody can control what becomes of the work they put out into the world?
Yes, touché, yes. It feels like today it's been said that previous generations knew less about the past, but they felt more connected to it. We have so much information available at our fingertips. We can sit on our couches and go on Wikipedia and learn about pretty much anything. But how deep or how shallow are those connections often? And so my ultimate goal for the book was that it would open up these points of contact through art for a much kind of deeper and richer and more textured connection with the past, and the kind of the empathy, the knowledge, and the sense of imperative that understanding would bring. The imperative being, these stories show us not necessarily that these Enlightenment values of the arts and of freedom and all of the kinds of things that were ennobled in those earlier days. It's not that these were all somehow lies, but that these are values that have to be affirmed and defended at every turn by a society. And I feel like the more shallow our relationship is to that history, the less we remember important points of contact like that. So the hope is that we can sort of deepen some of those connections in all of those ways.
That's great. Do any of you have any questions? The book's not out till tomorrow, so none of you can know what's in it.
You can go first if you like. I'm not sure that this is good for the first question. You might find it distracting, actually. I hope not. But it's about film scores, and well, you made a very persuasive case, an eloquent case, for the power of music alone to allow us to remember, to make connection with the past, to know something about what things were like back then, whatever. It would seem that the combination of music and film would potentially have more, well, perhaps a greater ability, but certainly an ability to do that, to bring the two together. So, and in many cases, film scores have made use of classical music directly. In other cases, the music director, gets composers to write something new. Can you say something about film scores in general, given the objective you have with the book? Anything really about film scores that comes to you in this general
Sure,
realm?
absolutely. Thank you for that question. Could everyone hear the question about film scores? So, the first thing that came to mind when you asked is that there was a really kind of a revelatory film called Night and Fog that came out in the 1950s, and by it was a French documentary about the camps, one of the earliest, and it had an incredible film score by Hans Eisler, the German composer, German Jewish composer, and that is just one example of, I think, the power that music and moving images can have sort of with each other. Eisler came to develop some really specific theories that I find compelling about how music should work with moving images. And part of it is, interestingly, he really felt that there should be, that when a film score tracks too carefully what we're seeing on film and just kind of reinforces the images that we're already taking in visually, then there's really no space left between the sound and the image for ourselves, for our own subjectivity, for our own sensibility. So Eisler's music in that film has a really interesting kind of almost distancing effect. Some of it is sort of upbeat and chipper, while there are kind of unbelievable images from the camps that are on the screen, and yet it's all done in a way that's really thoughtfully calculated to create a kind of distance for the viewer to inhabit. Philip Glass sometimes does similar things. Anyway, I think this is not a book about why film is not a powerful medium. It was just a chance to really speak about music, but I couldn't agree more that there are some really wonderful examples of their combined power.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank
Hi.
you so much. This is a very moving and thought-provoking. I cannot wait to read the book. I'm so sorry because I can't speak very well because I have a brain injury, but I'll try. There are so many questions I had, but I was thinking about I'm in my former life before my brain exploded, a cultural journalist and broadcaster and violinist, and I one of the an author, and I've written about music and classical music, and what the question I'm always asked is how we could make classical music meaningful and relevant. And I always try and say, it's just music. It is just music. But I'm getting even more worried about the gap between young people compared to even I'm thinking about, it was Bernstein's birthday a couple of days ago, and the second half of the 20th century, that normal, and I use that word with with the all the things, that even quite privileged white people don't feel like classical music has anything to do with their lives. And if you think about what's going on in this country and all the world in terms of politics, I, as you, believe that music can be part of the solution and the answer, but I'm very worried about that the lack of how you can get that to the people. And I wondered if you felt very positive about that, or whether you also feel, you're going to be for the converted, basically. I'm sure everyone here will be so excited to read your book, but I'm, I think about kids in DC public schools.
Yes, yeah.
and then some, if you think about what's going on in this country.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would say a few things. One is that I do hope that the book is read by folks who already know that they're passionate about classical music, but I am also hoping it was absolutely written to also have sort of multiple points of entry, multiple on-ramps. It's definitely a book written for people who are interested in history, a book of people who are interested in Jewish culture, a book of people who are interested in these larger questions of how art relates to our lives today. And that's part of, I think, what you were getting at is, respectfully, I think at what point you said that you tell them that music is only music. And I think that you meant that as a way of welcoming them to the art. And I think I couldn't agree more that we need to be as welcoming as we can. My strategy in this book is basically to say it's actually not only music, it's also all these other things. Music is history. Music is what turns history into memory. Music is this kind of, Stefan Zweig, whose name came up before, had this line from over a century ago. He was already writing, "All the bridges to yesterday are broken." That was over a century ago. And so I feel in a way that the book is my very small and modest attempt to introduce a different way of thinking about some of those questions and not convince people that, don't you see, Beethoven is great and has a lot to say to you today, but actually that there's this whole wider world that can be accessed through the pinhole of these arts, and that making some of those bigger connections are going to help us, again, know just not only how to listen, but really why we should care. Yeah, thank you.
I would throw in, since you can't say this and I read the book, that it's a very, very readable book. Jeremy's so erudite, it may not come through that this, you can't really say a book about the Holocaust of music is a fun read, but it's a can't put down kind of read. And
there are points of humor, yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite letters from Freud to his brother came as World War I was breaking, and there was kind of war hysteria sweeping the artists and intellectuals, and Freud writes to his brother, "I give all my libido to Austria-Hungary."
Thank you for your work and the information that you're putting out. I am very fortunate to have been exposed to music from Gregorian chants to everything that stops at rap hip hop in between. And fortunately, my 96-year-old mother was very musical, not playing instruments, but she had a nice singing voice and all the popular music. So I grew up knowing all the music from the 40s, 50s, until now. And my mother being 96, we, after she had a medical episode, we made sure to put all the music that she grew up loving and thanks to YouTube, we can play videos that, she can watch all her favorite people. She knows all the words. I also want to make a comment, several comments. Having several beliefs about life, and those of us who think life is eternal, we also think music is eternal. And fortunate for me, in early 20s, I came across a wonderful program on independent radio, Music from the Hearts of Space. So there are people who believe that music is streaming through the galaxy and it lands somewhere. I also have a comment of my disappointment, having worked in the medical field, that in the 80s there was talk of bringing music into the hospitals. It was already proven that music can heal certain conditions in the physical body. And unfortunately, it hasn't taken off really, as far as incorporating music with just overall health and well-being or healing from certain conditions. And so that's a disappointment I have.
Thank you for sharing those ideas, especially the stories about your mom. That's actually an amazing thing. I think you are also. Does she have some memory loss as well at this point?
Very little.
Very little. So that's great. One
Music
of the,
did that.
One of the things that actually is amazing is to see music's use in treatment for Alzheimer patients these days, and it can actually bring back these memories that had been all but inaccessible, and then you put somebody listens to music and a lot of that comes back. So I couldn't agree more about these connections between music and healing, and I actually personally learned about a lot of examples during the pandemic of really heartening moments where there was a big nationwide grassroots efforts among musicians whose concerts were closed down, they couldn't perform live, and patients who were really in difficult places needing to be lifted up. And so there were some really wonderful programs that sprang up to make those connections between the two populations. So hopefully there's hope in there too. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very, very much for this beautiful discussion. I should add one footnote on the Soviet war memorials. It seems like every one of them was to glorify the Soviet army, no matter where they put them all over the world. But Auschwitz was a bit different. When the Jews came into the camp, it was a World War I barracks, Polish army barracks. And when the Jews came in, they were brought in on trains. Camp commander came, big tower, still there, and addressed them all. He said, "There's only one way out of this camp, and that's through the chimney." And so the Soviets, when they came and took over the camp, captured it and all, they ordered that the rows, against our wishes, by the way, but anyway, they prevailed. They controlled it. And they ordered that rows and rows and rows of huge 80, 100-man barracks, 2 stories wood with a chimney on each end. They ordered that all except for one row to be torn down, totally demolished and eliminated, except they left all the chimneys because of what the camp commander said. And at the end of the camp, behind the ovens, 4 ovens, they're still there. One of them was collapsed. But behind the camp, there were 52 huge stone with a slanted face, this big each, all the way across the camp. And each one of them said the same thing. Here at the hands of the Nazi murderers lie, I think the number was 4 million, they said, but millions of,
Yeah.
I forgot what word they used, but
Yeah.
anyway, so that was maybe different.
Yeah. It's the amazing story that comes up, that came up in my research that I tell in the book is that's connected to Auschwitz is this kind of intergenerational thing, and mentioned the scratchy old recording that I talk about. That is a recording of the Bach double concerto for two violins, and one of the solo parts is taken up by a man named Arnold Rosé. The second is by a woman named Alma Rosé, a father-daughter. And Arnold was an Austrian Jew who rose to the very pinnacle of Central European musical life. He was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic for over 5 decades. And he was married to Mahler's sister. So he was really right in the heart of musical kind of, at the pinnacle of this tradition of musical excellence and kind of cultural, a sense of culture as this force that could renovate the self and improve all of our lives. His daughter tried to have a similar career in music into the war years, and she was ultimately caught, and her final assignment was as a conductor. This is Arnold Rosé's daughter, Mahler's niece. Her final assignment was as a conductor of an all-women's orchestra within the camp of Auschwitz. They were tasked with playing for marches when workers left the camp and came back, and they would also entertain the SS on weekends. So there's a famous expression or saying by the critic Walter Benjamin, who said that every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism. I think he meant it in some larger kind of philosophical, theoretical sense, but some of these stories really emphasize the fact that at this point in human history, the culture and barbarism, really any distinction between the two had disappeared, and they were sort of manifestly one and the same.
The guide told us, he said someone went downtown in Auschwitz and asked what was the smell, and the guide said, "They're burning the Jews tonight."
Thank you.
We've got a few questions left. If we can rapid fire them, great.
First and foremost, congratulations. I think not only am I going to read the book, I'm going to gift it to all the music lovers in my family.
Wonderful.
So,
thank you.
Thank you for that. You talked a lot about the intersection between memory and music. What is your take on all the cognitive and neuroscience studies that is really exploring today the impact of music on the body and the mind? Somebody touched upon health, but it goes much beyond that. So how does that really impact the memory aspect of it, as well as, the overall perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that I'm not a scientist, and I'm not in a great position to address the medical questions. The parts of the medical research that I find the most inspiring are actually what I was saying, this kind of the use of music to literally retrieve individuals' memories that are all but lost with the Alzheimer's patients. I'm absolutely a believer in all these other beneficial effects that we can't quite understand. It seems, back to the Renaissance, there have been kind of scholars and mystics who, for hundreds of years, have been working out these kind of medicinal properties of music, and so maybe one way to think about the book is it adds one other aspect to this to this kind of palliative or generative gift that music can give to all of us. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm curious about the 4 composers and how you chose them, and if it was hard to choose them. Like, was it obvious that these were the 4 composers, or did you, was it a very painstaking process to choose them? And also, do the 4 of them create like a whole picture, or are they just sort of like the top 4?
Great question. Thank you. The 4 composers, in a way, can be broken down into 2 pairs that were very revealing for me. because on the one hand, the whole first half of the book is about Schoenberg and Strauss, and in a way kind of reopens up the whole story of this kind of the relationship between Germans and Jews and all of its potential, as well as, of course, all of its tragedy. And to look at the two of them as kind of a dyad, a kind of pairing that were kind of bonded in their co-creation of modern culture. The two of them were one unit, and then the second half has Shostakovich and Britten, who had one of the more beautiful friendships in 20th century music, even though they spoke no common language and were writing from opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. So I like that there were two different pairings. I also like that during the years of the war itself, these four had very different, I think of them as standing at four different windows looking out onto the same catastrophe. And so they had each very different perspectives, and these incredible musical memorials that they made were premiered in 4 different countries. And so the premieres themselves open up these fascinating windows onto the history of memory, how these countries and these societies were telling the stories of the war differently. To give just a little example, one of the best stories, I think, in the whole book was what happened to Schoenberg's memorial, which was called A Survivor from Warsaw. It was one of the very first musical memorials to the Holocaust, really early, 1947, before there was a single monument anywhere in the country. And he sent this piece to the Serge Kusevitsky, the conductor, who had commissioned it through his foundation. Almost everything this conductor did commission, he premiered with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, venerable group. And in this case, it came to him, and he would not touch this piece. It had a narrator that described a really shocking scene from a concentration camp that for 1947 was just, in his view, untouchable. So you have this major musical memorial to the Holocaust by the founder of musical modernism, ended up having its world premiere in a university gymnasium in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with amateur forces in the orchestra and cowboys singing in the chorus. So I think it's really one of the strangest premieres in all of music history, and it's because of all of this incredible confluence of factors. So the stories that each of those 4 composers opened through their lives and through their art was also a big part in choosing them. Thank you, Sarah.
Your last question.
The seeds of this book, Jeremy, seem to flow from your 2004 article, Klezmer's Final Frontier, through your 2012 New Yorker piece, The String Theorist, through some of your recent work. My question is, what was the hardest thing that you left out? What got left on the cutting room floor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that one of the hardest things was that these stories opened up so much sort of sideways into their cultures that being able to keep a narrow enough through line, someone I know says that digression is the sunshine of narrative, which is a nice way of thinking about it. So I wanted to have room for digression, but not too much. And actually, a good friend of mine here in the audience tonight told me I had written pages upon pages about Mahler. Mahler was a composer who died before the First World War and left no musical memorials. And this friend went out on a limb and said, I'm going to guess that maybe you have more to say on Mahler for a different book. So there's a lot on Mahler that got left on the cutting room floor. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much. This was truly wonderful.
Thank you.
Huge round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
So, despite being officially on